Stephen Curtis, thanks so much for being here on New Mexico in Focus.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. Now, so much of the media coverage around Labor Day and the public discourse in general, it's about barbecues, you hear about beer, having the day off from work, hanging out with your friends. What do you want New Mexicans to think of when they celebrate Labor Day?
Well, I certainly want them to celebrate Labor Day, but I would also like for people to appreciate just how far the labor movement has come. You know, the AFL-CIO likes to describe themselves as the folks who brought you the weekend, and that is certainly very much true. In the early days of the American Federation of Labor, their political platform was seeking a 6-day work week and a 10-hour work day, which tells you just how difficult working conditions were at the time. And also appreciate that the early days of the labor movement were done with, frankly, hostility from the courts. In the early days of the labor movement in the United States, unions were considered to be either illegal civil or criminal conspiracies. They were subject to injunctions. They became subject to potential liability under the Sherman Antitrust Act if they engaged in concerted strikes or anything of that nature. And it wasn't until like 1935 before there were federal protections for private sector employees for engaging in union activities, forming, joining, or assisting a labor organization, or engaging in other concerted activities for mutual aid and benefit. And so a lot of the early gains of the labor movement in the United States were were dealing with opposition from the courts and the legal system. And now that we have a slightly stronger legal system, people might take that for granted. So I certainly hope that people reflect a little on labor history on Labor Day.
Sure. Let's talk about your work as a labor attorney in our state. Who are the people and organizations that you represent, and why, generally speaking, do they need your help?
Okay, so the firm I work at represents both public and private sector labor unions in New Mexico. We also represent individual workers. The types of unions that we represent, for example, would be in the private sector side, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, the International Union of Operating Engineers, the Teamsters, the United Food and Commercial Workers, and a whole host of them. On the public sector side, we also represent the AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, as well as some unions that sort of straddle the public and private sector divide, such as the National Union of Hospital and Healthcare Employees, District 1199. Unions need legal help because they are facing represented employers. Employers typically have legal counsel, and so they need legal help in organizing and getting certified either through a state or federal administrative agency as the exclusive bargaining representative. They need help sometimes in collective bargaining because the employers are usually represented by their attorneys at the bargaining table. Sometimes they need help in grievance and arbitration settlements. Individual workers also need help because the legal system is kind of complex. There's a vast administrative array of options that are sometimes available to employees if they are either having problems getting paid correctly under the Fair Labor Standards Act or subject to discrimination under either Title VII or any of the equivalent federal or state laws. So that's why workers would come to a lawyer such as myself.
Okay. I want to talk about one of those cases specifically. In 2020, Youths in Valdez, your firm represented workers who successfully sued Kelly's Brew Pub and Restaurant for wage theft. Maybe touching on that one specifically, but maybe others. What are a few typical tactics that a business might use to squeeze a few extra dollars out of their workers?
Okay, so there's a variety of things that can happen. Sometimes off-the-clock work is the problem, where they require either pre- or post-shift work to be performed where not on the clock. That Kelly's case you mentioned involved a restaurant that was pooling tips, which is allowed, but then using some of the pool tips, the lawsuit alleged, were using some of the pool tips for purposes other than distributing them to workers, so which is not allowed. Handling tip pools is another potential area. On the clock off the clock work is relatively common. Another problem that some employers have is misclassifying. So they can either misclassify their employees as exempt under the Fair Labor Standards Act, meaning that they are not entitled to overtime. So then they require them to work in excess of 40 hours a week and pay them overtime because they have misclassified them as exempt. They can also sometimes, although I think this is less common, misclassify them as independent contractors rather than employees. An independent contractor wouldn't be entitled to the same legal protections that an employee would.
Okay.
So those are some of the ways in which wage theft can occur. And sometimes it's simply just in some industries, the payroll systems are a little informal and they're just not paid correctly for all the hours they worked.
Sure. Now, from where you sit as a labor attorney, how has the state of play for workers, be they unionized or just individuals, how has it changed over the years? And what has driven that shift in your mind?
So locally here in New Mexico, when I, first started, the private sector labor unions in the private sector are governed by a federal law, the National Labor Relations Act, and the federal administrative agency, the National Labor Relations Board. When I first started practicing, that board was appointed by Bush the Younger and was, I think, fair to say, not favorably inclined towards unions. And so we faced legal barriers. Currently, the board is largely appointed by Biden and have made decisions that are more pro-labor than previous boards have. However, what we're dealing with now is the fact that the National Labor Relations Board has been woefully underfunded for at least a decade now. And there's attrition, and as a result, there's not enough employees of the National Labor Relations Board to enforce the laws that they have, the law that they are supposed to enforce. So we're dealing with difficulties in enforcement. We have more favorable decisions that are helping us, but difficulties in enforcement. On the public sector side, New Mexico is blessed. The labor movement came together and was instrumental in passing the Healthy Workplaces Act, which for the private sector employees in New Mexico requires employers to provide a certain amount of paid sick leave during the year, which wasn't a requirement prior to the passage of that law. That's been hugely beneficial to employees in New Mexico. Public sector employees are, in the union context, are governed by what's called the Public Employees Bargaining Act. And in 2020, again, the labor movement came together and got some pretty helpful amendments to that law that make it easier to organize workers in the face of potential opposition, and has stronger administrative remedies available if public sector employers engage in prohibited practices.
Okay. Now I want to talk about union membership a little bit. We know that it peaked nationally in the 1950s. Roughly a third of workers in the U.S. were union members at that time. These days, we're down to about 10%. Do those numbers reflect what's happening in New Mexico, too?
I think the general trend is the same.
Okay.
I recently looked at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and for 2023, union membership in New Mexico ranked us roughly around 30 out of 51, if I recall correctly. So we're kind of middle of the pack. We're certainly not as hostile to unions in New Mexico as in some of the southern states where the membership is as low as like 2.5%. But we're certainly not like some of the more industrial East Coast states that have a much higher union membership. So I think broadly speaking, the trend in New Mexico reflects that same trend in the national trend, but is potentially a little bit, we're slightly above average, I guess is.
Okay. What's driven that trend?
Nationally?
And here.
And here. Well, again, so 1947 saw amendments to the National Labor Relations Act. That was first enacted via the Wagner Act in 1935. In 1947, the Taft-Hartley amendments to that act made it more difficult for unions to exercise some of their economic weapons, such as secondary strikes or those types of things. And so the legal framework changed, and that has precipitated a decline. I think also the nature of work in the United States is changing, from potentially easier to organize factory or industrial workers to more difficult to organize service-based employees. That is another potential causal factor. I think also union, well, to use the euphemism, union avoidance tactics, or what we would refer to as union busting, has become more sophisticated over the years, where employers are increasingly getting advice from consultants on how to defeat a union organizing campaign.
Okay. Now, with that declining membership, have unions' political power also waned in New Mexico, and what are the consequences of that?
Certainly, I think that unions in New Mexico, their political influence is greater than their potential membership would indicate. In part because, unions, labor is never going to be as well funded as capital. That's just simply not going to be the case ever. But union has something that capital doesn't, which is ability to mobilize workers. So unions have the ability to engage in member-to-member communications. They have the ability to engage in get-out-the-vote efforts. They are active politically. They have the ability to organize folks to appear in front of and testify on behalf of bills in the legislature, in the New Mexico legislature. So they do have, they still have influence. It obviously isn't as great as it once would. But again, looking back to some, recent successes, I don't think the Healthy Workplaces Act or the amendments to the Public Employees Bargaining Act would have happened if it weren't for organized labor.
Okay. Much of the state and national conversation about the economy, it revolves around Wall Street, the stock market, GDP, job reports, things like that. In other words, it's usually held from a perspective of power, corporations, business interests. This seems pretty far from the original concept of Labor Day, which began as a celebration of labor's accomplishments. What is the current state of the economy from the perspective of the labor movement in New Mexico?
I think that, in my impression, that the current state of the economy is that it isn't working for all workers. The economy, the gap between the haves and the have-nots has not shrunk and has arguably increased. And, one of the main drivers for me personally, being a labor lawyer, is to rectify that, is to try to level the playing field, to have the economy benefit both labor and capital as close to equally as possible. And that's certainly not the case currently. So I hope that, the labor movement is able to offset some of the excesses of unregulated capital, which would concentrate wealth in the hands of the few, as opposed to the people who actually generate the wealth through their labor. And that's why I do what I do. I think a focus on the gap between the haves and the have-nots and the rate of return for profit to capital versus to labor is something that we should focus on more than some of the other statistics that you mentioned just then.
Okay. Now, in addition to the work that you do and just described, what else is needed in New Mexico to ensure proper wages and working conditions?
So I think there are several excellent organizations in New Mexico. Somos un Pueblo Unido is an advocacy group for potentially undocumented employees. El Centro also provides services to the immigrant community. And there's a lot of exploitation, in my experience, of workers in the immigrant community, whether documented or undocumented. So those types of organizations are vital, because wage theft is fairly prevalent in the types of industries that immigrant workers tend to work in. I think also aggressive. We were blessed with a pretty strong Department of Workforce Solutions, but they, like a lot of agencies, need resources the same as many others, and they provide mechanisms for employees who feel like they're the victims of wage theft to get relief without having to go and contact an attorney. And those are very vital because there are some of these wage theft cases are of relatively small amounts such that it would be difficult to have an attorney agree to take them on, but are vital for the worker. And so having a swift and effective administrative remedy that can be accomplished without involving a lawyer is pretty important, I think. I think also, our state government laws, I think, are generally not bad in terms of being favorable to labor, but state government is having the same problems with recruiting as any other employers are these days. And so increasing the ranks of the state employees and forcing, for example, in New Mexico, Occupational Safety and Health Administration Act would be very important.
Okay. Now, quickly, as we wrap up here, what's the outlook for workers and unions in New Mexico moving forward? If there was a spectrum of hope and despair, where would you place us at this point?
So I have sort of a kind of a bicameral mind on that. I simultaneously experience hope and despair. The despair comes from, the recent decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court seems to be questioning the very basis of the administrative state in New Mexico. So in the last term, we had the Jarchese decision involving the SEC and whether or not they could pursue remedies without providing a jury trial for the potential people violating securities laws that may have an impact on the National Labor Relations Board. In my opinion, it shouldn't, but it may. There's also been the Loper-Bright decision, which questioned the notion of deferral to administrative agencies' interpretations of statutes. So legally, it seems like there seems to be assault, perhaps is too strong of a word, but questioning of the administrative state that provides much of the worker protection in the United States. On the other hand, there's been a lot of polling of support for unions, and certainly amongst young employees, the support for unions has never been higher. Literally never been higher since the polling has been done. That gives me some hope. That, coupled with some of the organic organizing drives that I've seen pop up, for example, in Starbucks, which were not top-down driven union campaigns to organize. They were bottom-up campaigns from Starbucks employees who were sort of fed up with their working conditions. That gives me a lot of hope. That carries forward to, in New Mexico, for example, the UNM and NMSU, their graduate student workers, organized recently and have achieved some significant successes at the bargaining table. So I still maintain, perhaps a little Pollyanna-ish, but I still maintain a certain optimism for the future with the support that unions enjoy amongst young employees.
All right. Stephen Curtis, thank you so much for being here on New Mexico in Focus.
Thank you very much for having me.